Welcome, fellow night owls and history enthusiasts, to another journey into the shadows of the past. Let your mind settle. You're about to drift gently into the slow rhythm of history, not the loud history of conquests or courts, but the quiet, deliberate kind. The kind where people got up before the sun and trimmed leaves, moved water, and made sure no slippered foot of royalty ever touched dry soil. Tonight, we go back to Mughal India specifically, to its great imperial gardens, and the men who kept them blooming while the emperor slept soundly in his bed. Let's begin. Not with emperors or wars, but with silence, the silence of pre-dawn. In a Mughal palace was something cultivated deliberately. Those cities like Agra or Lahore buzzed with activity by midday. Within the garden walls of the palace, quiet was currency. And nowhere was that silence more sacred than in the sleeping quarters of the Padishah, the emperor himself. The Mughal court was a place of grandeur. Yes, but also of subtle rituals and invisible labor. The courtiers, cooks, perfumers, eunuchs, scribes, tutors, astronomers, painters, and laundrymen all had their hours. But among them, the gardeners, those quiet custodians of the living palace, worked the strangest hours of all. Their primary task, of course, was water. You see, Mughal emperors were obsessed with gardens, not just for leisure, but as a kind of living philosophy. The Persian concept of Shabaga, quadrilateral garden divided into 4 parts by water channels, was not merely aesthetic, it was cosmological. A garden was a miniature universe, flowing water, flowering trees, terraced levels, and quiet paths, all designed to reflect paradise. Babur, the first Mughal emperor, once wrote in his memoirs that a garden is the noblest of all pleasures. And indeed, no palace or fortress, no matter how fortified, was complete without a carefully constructed green space. But watering these paradises, especially during dry seasons, was a logistical riddle. One might imagine fountains gushing and streams murmuring throughout the day, but that would disturb the royal rest. Emperors did not like to be woken by the sound of clattering buckets, squeaking pulleys, or shouting laborers, and so imperial horticulture became an art of discretion. Gardeners, known in Persian as bagbans, had to move like ghosts in the early hours before dawn. The bagbans would begin their slow ritual. Some used the rahata, Persian wheel-powered, by oxen walking in endless circles. It drew water from underground wells, sending it into raised channels. But the noise of the oxen was often too much. So, for quieter tasks, they relied on hand-lifting devices like the karaza, simple contraption of 2 leather buckets tied to ropes. The gardener would lower one bucket into a cistern or stepwell, then use a seesawing motion to draw water and gently pour it into narrow stone runnels that crisscrossed the garden beds. The sound of water trickling was acceptably and encouraged. It was part of the auditory experience of paradise, but not too much. A gardener's job was to keep the water flowing just enough that the roses and jasmine wouldn't wilt, and the emperor wouldn't stir. They walked barefoot. That part is worth. Lingering on, bagbans in the Mughal court were required to remove their shoes before entering certain sections of the garden, closest to the palace's sleeping quarters. Leather soles scuffed the gravel, and even the rustle of a slipper could carry in the still air. Many went barefoot out of reverence, but also out of necessity. Their footsteps had to be as quiet as the dew. Then there were the water schedules. Not all plants could be watered at the same time. Certain flowers, like the fragrant kura or camphor, needed their roots misted just before sunrise. Others, like saffron crocus, were sensitive to waterlogging. Gardeners carried small notebooks, sometimes stitched into their waistbands, the best hours for each variety. These notes were often passed down from father to son, or shared in hushed exchanges over shared clay cups of milk at dusk. Interestingly, Mughal gardens were designed not just for their visual symmetry, but also for efficiency. Channels were sloped very precisely by mere centimeters, so that water moved slowly from one quadrant to another. The entire garden became a silent clock, each corner watered in sequence by gravity alone. A good gardener merely had to lift the first sluice gate and let the system whisper into motion. Of course, not every garden could rely on such elegance. Some palaces, particularly those in drier regions like Rajasthan or the Deccan, required elaborate underground water systems, called qanats. These were gently sloping tunnels that brought water from distant sources, often buried meters below the ground to prevent evaporation. Inspecting and maintaining these silent lifelines was also the job of the gardener, or, more specifically, the Nakashi Bugda, garden engineer. These men moved underground, working by lamplight, clearing debris with curved bronze scrapers, making sure the water kept flowing to the surface without a sound. One surviving record from the court of Shah Jahan tells of a gardener named Gulbaz, who once spent 3 days unclogging a collapsed qanat outside the Shalimar Bog in Lahore. He emerged covered in mud, clothes torn. When the emperor was told of his work, he ordered Gulbaz to be bathed, clothed, and fed quietly. Of course, and gifted him a tiny plot of land within the garden. A paradise within paradise. But it wasn't just irrigation that required silence. Even pruning was an art of stealth. The Mughal garden had to be constantly clipped, shaped, and brushed. Thorny bushes were carefully managed so they didn't grow too close to the walkways. With hand-forged shears-quiet ones, well-oiled gardeners would snip at rose stems under moonlight. Dried leaves were removed with long-handled brushes made of soft peacock feathers sometimes. Gardeners carried copper bells filled with sand to scatter around freshly planted bulbs. Why? Not to signal anything, but because the soft crunch of sand underfoot warned them not to step on the garden beds while walking backward. The gardeners knew every tree by its needs. Neem trees liked to be shaded in early summer. Pomegranate trees needed the soil packed down after every watering. Ashoka trees were trimmed into narrow pyramids, their leaves turned inward to create a sense of enclosure. There were even whisperings that a few older trees, like the 300-year-old mango tree in the Fetafur Sikri garden, were to be greeted silently every morning with a slight bow. Whether this was ritual or superstition, the records do not say. And so, under the weight of all this silent responsibility, the Bagbons performed their choreographists, men moving slowly through fragrant air, barefoot on cobbled stone, carrying ancient water to thirsty roots. All to ensure that when the emperor woke and walked through his garden at dawn, everything was perfect. But not all mornings were perfect. What happened when a fountain stopped flowing? Or a squirrel chewed through a cedar branch, sending it crashing onto the tiled walkway? What did a gardener do when the emperor's sleep was disturbed? That question leads us to the next part of our quiet tale. Mistakes, moonlight, and Mughal disciplinamate this. The sun has not yet broken the horizon. The marble pavilions of the Mughal palace are still wrapped in the soft blue-grey haze of pre-dawn. A single gardener kneels beside a flower bed gently, tucking soil around the base of a marigold plant. The only sounds are a distant owl, the hush of water slipping along a stone channel, and the occasional breeze fluttering the edges of silk tapestries hanging from the gardens colonnades. Then dash crack. A branch, once made brittle by drought and ignored by its attendant, breaks loose from an overgrown neem tree. It falls directly onto the tiled path outside the women's quarters, and inside, the emperor stirs. What happened next in moments like this was rarely written down in full, but fragments appear in the margins of royal correspondence, gardeners, logs, and administrative reports, and piecing them together gives us a surprisingly vivid picture of what it meant to be a Mughal gardener. When things went wrong, let's begin with the structure. The Mughal imperial gardens were not unregulated. Idols. They were maintained through a hierarchy, much like any military or religious institution. At the base were the bagbens, ordinary gardeners and water carriers. Above them were the mutamims, or garden supervisors, men with decades of experience, and, often, letters of recommendation from noble patrons. The highest rank was reserved for the Nakshonavis, or garden architects, those who planned layouts, adjusted water flow, and submitted seasonal proposals to the imperial court. But make no mistake, even the humblest bagban was held to a strict code: cleanliness, quiet, consistency. When something broke that code, the consequences could range from a sharp warning to outright dismissal. One record from Akbar's court in Fetafur Sikri describes a young gardener named Rahim, who forgot to close a sluice gate before sunrise. The eastern quadrant of the royal garden flooded, creating soggy mud trails along the rose beds. Rahim was summoned not to court, but to the office of the There, he was given two choices: a formal whipping of 5 lashes, or the night shift, which meant solitary irrigation duty during the most mosquito-filled hours of the monsoon. He chose the latter. According to the record, he served in silence and with a copper bell filled with salt to ward off spirits and leeches. He was later promoted. The Mughal system of discipline was not arbitrary, though it revolved around the concept of Naz. And in a palace where the emperor was believed to be the very axis of heaven and earth, the disruption of his rest was not just a personal offense, it was a metaphysical one. This is why even the smallest tasks were accompanied by ceremonial quiet. Lanterns used in pre-dawn watering were fitted with double screens to muffle their glow. Buckets were polished not for appearance, but so they wouldn't creak at the handle. Gardeners communicated in gestures or whispers. Elaborate hand signals were passed down like trade secrets. But even with all precautions, mistakes happened. And sometimes they happened under the wrong moon. The Mughals, like many empires, influenced by Persian and Indian traditions, paid close attention to the lunar calendar. Certain nights, particularly during Amavasya, the new moon, were considered inauspicious for loud tasks or new plantings. Gardens were to be tended gently, without significant movement or pruning. A slip during such a night was believed to cause not just displeasure, but imbalance. A cracked flower pot could be seen as an omen. A disturbed emperor during a new moon was to be avoided at all costs. So, how did gardeners navigate these risks? One method was delegation. The Mughal palaces employed a rotating team of nighttime gardeners known as kamash, bagbans, literally silent gardeners. These were the most trusted of all. Older, highly skilled, often semi-retired men whose job was to tend only the most delicate plants near the emperor's chamber. They were paid slightly more, worked fewer hours, and often had the privilege of wearing softer clothes dyed cotton instead of coarse linen to make less noise. One such man, named Yusuf the Elder, left behind a curious diary in Persian script, copied years later by a court scribe. In it, he describes how he once repaired a leaking fountain valve using nothing but wax, string, and his own shirt cuff, so that the emperor's dream would not be troubled by the sound of splashing. His reward was a gold coin pressed into his hand at breakfast by the emperor's steward, with a note for the silence. Then there were the adaptations. In colder seasons, when metal watering cans clinked against stone walkways, gardeners began wrapping them in strips of wool. The practice spread across several gardens, and a specific kind of muffling wrap was even recorded in the inventory of Shah Jahan's Red Fort garden stores. Cloth was dyed blue, the color of coolness and sleep. Even tools were redesigned, pruning. Shears were made with thinner blades and lined handles. Water scoops were carved from soft teak rather than clanking bronze. A new form of rackshort, wide, nearly soundless, was introduced in the imperial gardens of Kashmir and spread rapidly to Lahore and Delhi. And all of this, the redesigns, the silence, the discipline, was not just for beauty. It was to serve the emperor's experience of perfection. For when he awoke and walked the garden at dawn, he was not supposed to think about the labor. The rows should seem effortless. The sound of water should appear eternal. The gravel path should feel freshly swept, as if the world itself had arranged itself for his feet. A single twig in the wrong place could ruin the illusion. But one might ask, didn't the emperor know? Was he truly unaware of the hundreds of hands that maintained his paradise while he slept? Some records suggest that the emperors were more involved than we might think. Babur famously participated in designing his own gardens and wrote extensively about their flaws and virtues. Jahangir once paused an audience to send for a particular gardener who had coaxed a fig tree into flowering early. Even Aurangzeb, often depicted as austere, once intervened to pardon a gardener accused of overwatering jasmine, writing, "Let beauty be judged in the light of dawn, not punishment." So yes, the emperors knew, but they preferred not to see the effort. The perfection of the garden was its own mask, and those who labored behind that mask were valued most when they were invisible. Still, one can't help but wonder what became of the gardeners whose efforts were forgotten, who carried water for 30 years and never once saw the emperor smile. Their stories are not often recorded, but in the next section, we'll explore the lives of those anonymous hands, their routines, their humor, and what they left behind among the roots and fountains of Mughal paradise. The gardener's legacy beneath the petals. You return now to the garden. The sun is rising soft, golden light soaking into the walls of red sandstone and white marble. The fountains are just beginning their daily rhythm, and a thin mist hovers low over the garden beds. It is peaceful, and if you listen closely, you'll hear nothing. That is exactly how it was meant to be. But long after the emperors were gone, long after their courts were silenced and their palaces turned to monuments, the gardens remained, and so did the traces, quiet, enduring traces of the gardeners who once tended them. Who were these men? Most came from humble backgrounds. Many were the sons and grandsons of previous gardeners, inheriting not titles or land, but knowledge. A deep, wordless knowledge of soil, root systems, water flow, and seasonal timing. They knew when to sow and when to stop, when to prune and when to wait. Their names were rarely recorded in royal documents only. The mutamims and architects were credited in official chronicles. But in the local ledgers, in the neighborhood memories passed down orally near Lahore, Delhi, or Agra, these bagbons lived on. Some names we do have. A gardener named Nisamuddin, who maintained the sunken beds of the Hayat Baksh Garden in Delhi for over 40 years, was known for growing roses that bloomed 1 week earlier than anyone else's. A family of 3 brothers in Kashmir, Shakib, Moya and Imran, were employed for nearly 60 years across 3 reigns to manage the China trees lining the Shalima Canal. They developed a method of air pruning using silk nets to gently shape tree growth without breaking branches. Their tools were simple. Each gardener carried a cloth satchel. Inside, you might find a wooden dibber for planting bulbs, a copper scoop worn smooth by years of lifting water, a dull-bladed knife for trimming soft stems, and often a scrap of cloth soaked in rosewater for cleaning, for cooling the face. And sometimes, simply to inhale on particularly long nights. They also carried poems. Yes, poems. You see. The Mughal garden was not just a place of plant sit, was a place of poetry. Court poets wrote verses about tulips and jasmine, likening them to lovers, stars, and divine light. But gardeners composed their own poetry, 2 short, earthy couplets scratched onto walls, sung to themselves under their breath or traded, like riddles over shared lentils in the worker kitchens. One such verse, found scrawled in fading ink on the back of a garden ledger from 1706, reads, "The emperor walks where roses bloom, but it is my back that carries the spring." That kind of quiet humor, humble, observant, a little cheeky, was typical. Gardeners, after all, lived with the earth. They knew how emperors changed with the seasons, just like fruit trees. How the same ruler who demanded silence in March would complain about mosquitoes in May. And yet, the work went on. Their days were long in summer. They rose before dawn and napped under fig trees in the heat of the afternoon. In winter, they lit small braziers near the water channels to keep frost from forming. There were always tasks: deadheading, marigolds, cleaning pebbles, brushing paths, inspecting fountains for algae. Yet, despite this unending work, gardeners were not without their own moments of peace. Some grew secret corners of the garden just for themselves. A patch of tulsi, a jasmine trellis bent into a hidden bench. One anonymous bagbong at the Metab bog across the Yamuna from the Taj Mahal carved his name, Asif, into a low stone beside a cypress. His carving was so small and unobtrusive that it was only discovered in the 1990s during restoration work. It simply read, "Watered for 22 years. May the trees remember me." And perhaps they did. In the tradition of Mughal garden design, trees were often planted with both utility and symbolism in mind. The pomegranate for prosperity, the neem for healing, the cypress for immortality. To tend these trees was, in a way, to tend memory itself. Gardeners understood that while the emperor might not remember their names, the trees might. The earth, they believed, did not forget. When the empire weakened and the great courts began to crumble, the royal gardens suffered. Maintenance was cut, fountains dried, flower beds grew wild. But in many cases, the descendants of the original gardeners stayed on. Not because they were paid, but because they felt responsible. A kind of ancestral duty, passed down not by decree but by habit, by footstep, by touch, even into the colonial period. British officials remarked sometimes with amused confusion at how some Mughal gardens still operated on the same old schedules. Local men would appear before dawn, tend the same beds, water from the same wells, and disappear again before breakfast. No one had hired them, they simply showed up. And in doing so, they preserved something more than plants. They preserved The rhythm, the slow, sleepy rhythm of tending something not for applause, but for perfection. A garden where each petal was turned toward the sun at just the right angle, and each path swept just enough to seem untouched. Where silence was both a skill and a gift, and they left behind more than footprints. They left behind cuttings, soil, routines, irrigation tricks passed from uncle to nephew. A way of holding a watering scoop so the splash landed like rain, not thunder. A method for layering night-blooming jasmine and day-blooming hibiscus so the scent remained constant. These were their legacies. Small, fragrant, quietly alive. And now, if you ever walk through an old Mughal garden, if you find yourself in Shalima, or Humanene's tomb, or the Meta bog, you might sense it. A presence, a quiet continuity. Someone, once, walked here in the dark with bare feet and a watering pot, making sure the emperor slept well, and, in a way, that effort never stopped, because the water still flows, and the flowers still bloom even when no one is watching, even when everyone has fallen asleep. Smoke, stones, and the first loaves of light. Close your eyes and imagine it. The Roman city is still sleeping. The marble statues along the forum are draped in shadow. The courtyards are hushed, save for the rustle of olive trees and the creak of a shuttered window here and there. And yet, through narrow alleyways, behind domed baths and terracotta-tiled roofs, a different world is already wide awake. Because it is 4 a.m., and the bakers are already at work. In a Roman city like Pompeii, Ostia, or Rome itself, the bakerpista in Latin was one of the first to rise and one of the last to rest. Before senators debated, before soldiers trained, before poets composed odes to the gods, someone had to bake the bread. And that, humble though it may sound, was no small thing. Bread wasn't just food in Rome, it was infrastructure. You might not think of loaves of wheat bread as central to empire, but for Rome they were. Entire political careers rose and fell on bread prices. Public ovens were as crucial as aqueducts, and a reliable baker, one who could feed a district without burning a single batch, was as respected in his community as a blacksmith or physician. So what exactly did a Roman baker do at 4 a.m.? Let's begin, as they did, with the fire. Most Roman ovens were wood-fired, beehive-shaped domes made of stone or brick. The baker's assistant, or sometimes a team of enslaved workers, depending on the size of the operation, would begin the night by building a roaring fire inside the oven itself. This fire wasn't used to bake directly, but to heat the thick stone walls. Once those walls glowed with stored heat, the ashes were swept out, and the residual warmth alone would bake the bread. And it had to be just right. Too hot, and the crust would blacken before the crumb could rise. Too cool, and the loaves would emerge pale and undercooked. So the baker developed a near mystical sensitivity to heat. They would test the temperature by tossing a bit of flour on the hearth floor to see how quickly it browned. Some dabbed the inner walls with wet fingers, listening for the hiss. Others could simply wave a hand inside and judge, like tuning an instrument. Next came the grain. In the early days of Rome, most people ground their own flour at home. But by the imperial period, baking had become commercialized. Millstones were housed in the same buildings as ovens. These mills were often powered by donkeys or enslaved workers who walked in endless circles to turn the massive, basalt-grinding wheels. The noise would begin softly before dawnstone grinding against stone. Hushed voices in the dark. The flour produced was coarse, with flecks of bran, unless it was double-sifted for special orders. There was no automation, no steel rollers, just grit, muscle, and the smell of cracked grain. The most common bread was called Poni's quadratisa, round, scored loaf with a slightly domed top. If you've seen the preserved loaves from Pompeii, you'll recognize it immediately. Flat base, firm crust, 8 symmetrical wedges pressed into the top with a string or blade before baking. The wedge lines made it easier to divide. Some say it also made the loaf bake more evenly. Others believe it was simply aesthetic. Romans liked their bread to look tidy. But before it could bake, it had to rise. That meant yeast, or rather, sourdough. Starter, what the Romans called fermentum. Every good bakery had a pot of bubbling beige, slightly sour-smelling paste that was fed daily with flour and water. This living culture was their treasure. It was never to be neglected. A dead starter meant flat bread, and flat bread meant angry customers, missed orders, and scorn from neighbors. Some bakers guarded their fermentum with superstitious care, even adding honey or fruit skins to keep it lively. Others whispered that a few drops of olive oil made the starter less moody. Whatever the trick, the early hours before sunrise were spent mixing flour, water, and a scoop of this ferment into massive clay bowls. Then the kneading began. Imagine 10, 12, 15 kilograms of dough being turned and folded by hand. Wooden tables dusted with flour, muscles moving in rhythm, the air filled with the damp, warm scent of wet grain. Bakers often worked in silence at this hour, focused on feel, dough too sticky, add flour, too dry, add water, too cold. Warm your hands, breathe on it, wait. Once kneaded, the dough was left to rise in low baskets or cloth-covered bowls. And here was the challenge. The baker had to time the rise with the oven heat. Too soon, and the oven wouldn't be ready. Too late, and the dough would collapse. This delicate timing, matching fire with fermentation, was the true art of baking. All the while, the city around them slept. Roman cities were not quiet places by day. There were hawkers, chariots, orators, animals, children, merchants shouting their prices. But in the early morning, as the bakers worked by oil lamp, the noise came only from within. The puff of bellows, the scraping of shovels, the occasional hum of a tune from a baker trying to stay awake. By 5 a.m., the first loaves were shaped and laid on wooden paddles. They were slid into the oven carefully, no crowding, no stacking. Roman ovens baked from radiant heat, so loaves were spaced apart like chess pieces on a board. A good baker knew which spots baked faster. The center was hottest. The edges needed longer. Some bakeries even staggered their batches to account for cooling early loaves for the wealthy and officials, late ones for the common stalls. And so the bread began to rise. Inside the oven, the outer crust would set quickly, sealing. In steam, the loaves crackled. The room filled with the scent of toast and fermentation, like the inside of a warm barrel. Assistants kept track of time with oil timers or by watching shadows. There were no alarms, just instinct, practice, and the weight of daily necessity, because this bread had a destination. Some loaves were bound for the public dole. Rome famously distributed free or subsidized grain and bread to citizens, a system that made bakers integral to politics. If a shipment was late, if the bread was undercooked, riots could follow. Grain prices were monitored like the weather. A baker who served the dole had both power and pressure. Other loaves were sold at the Macellum, the Roman marketplace. Some were destined for taverns, others for private homes. Some were delivered door to door by slaves. Wealthier clients requested breads with sesame, poppy seeds, or honey glazes. Others wanted their family mark pressed into the top of the loaf before baking a kind of edible signature. And then there were the leftover crumbs. Even these were valuable. They were swept up, dried, and sold as poultry feed or stuffing for sausages. Nothing went to waste. By sunrise, the bakery was loud with footsteps. Buyers arrived with baskets and coins. The ovens cooled. The firewood was stacked for the next night, and the bakers, covered in flour, shoulders sore, finally sat on low stools to eat their own breakfasts. Sometimes just a crust dipped in oil. Sometimes a bit of goat cheese or olives. They watched the city awaken, knowing that they had already put in a full day's labor before the senators even tied their sandals. But what happened when disaster struck? When the millstones broke, or the fire went out, or the grain shipment failed to arrive on time? In the next section, we'll explore the risks and clever solutions of the Roman baking world, and how these early morning workers kept the empire fed, even during chaos and shortages. Now the city is awake. You can hear the clatter of sandals on stone streets, the squawk of poultry being brought to market, the hum of vendors setting out their olives, chickpeas, and salted fish. But inside the bakery, though, the hardest work of the day is done. The day's real test is only just beginning. Because in Rome, being a baker wasn't just about dough and fire. It was about resilience. Things went wrong often, and sometimes spectacularly. Let us begin with a stone. More specifically, the catalyst and metather, two parts of the Roman rotary millstone used for grinding grain. The meta sat fixed on the bottom, like a cone, and the catalyst rotated above it, grinding the grain poured through a hole in the top. The design was genius efficient, durable, and capable of producing flour on an industrial scale. But it was also temperamental. If the millstones were worn unevenly or a pebble got into the grain sack, the grinding could seize up or spark. The smallest chip could cause uneven flour, or worse, a break in the gear mechanism that turned the upper stone. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, there was panic. In large-scale bakeries, bakers assigned apprentices specifically to maintain the mills. These Molitor's millmen knew how to judge when a stone was too hot, too dry, too dull. They filed the grooves with metal. Scrapers cooled the stone with water if it overheated, and fed the donkeys or slaves who turned them. They were part mechanic, part caretaker, but not every bakery had a team in smaller districts. When a stone cracked, the baker had to act fast. Some kept a second, set rare and expensive. Others walked the city to borrow or barter for mealtime. In the worst cases, they bought pre-ground flour at inflated prices and hoped no one noticed the taste. Then there were the fires. The Roman oven called a furnax was a marvel of engineering. But it had no temperature knob. Everything was judged by sight, smell, or instinct. One misjudged batch of fuel list, especially if the wood was too resinous, could cause soot to build up and flare unexpectedly. If the ashes weren't swept out completely before baking, the bottom crust would turn bitter in a society where many customers paid in advance or relied on daily delivery. A ruined batch could be catastrophic. A baker might lose contracts, reputation, or even be fined by local magistrates for spoiling public provision. To prevent disaster, some bakers employed fumery spot watchers. These were young boys or elderly assistants who sat near the chimney with a slotted paddle and watched how the smoke rose. Thin white smoke meant the oven was ready. Thick, dark smoke meant more drying or cooling was needed. It was an informal science, and more than one baker's livelihood depended on the nose of a 12-year-old boy with soot in his hair. But beyond the mechanical risks, there were political ones. Bread in Rome was a public affair. The grain a known estate supplied. Grain was doled out to qualified citizens at low or no cost, especially in times of crisis. Private bakers were contracted to process and distribute that grain into loaves. The baker was, therefore, part businessman and part bureaucrat, and with that came pressure. During shortages caused by failed harvests, interrupted shipping routes, or political unrest, grain could arrive late or not at all. Bakers still had to deliver. This is where a certain kind of cleverness emerged. Survival innovation. Some bakers began stretching their flour with lamentima, kind of fine bean meal made from ground legumes. Others added chestnut flour or even old, stale bread, rehydrated and mixed into the dough to add bulk. These additions were quietly accepted in lean times, but punished if discovered during abundance. Quality control was overseen by aediles, Roman officials tasked with maintaining order in markets and public supply chains. A baker found cheating too obviously could be flogged, fined, or, worse, barred from practicing. To cope with uncertainty, bakeries began to resemble miniature fortresses of preparation. Some built underground storage for backup grain, sealed in clay jars and rotated weekly. Others struck deals with private millers in the countryside. The wealthiest formed cooperatives, grouping several bakeries under one network to share resources in emergencies. And yet, despite the risks, there was stability in the bread trade because people needed it. Bakers became known figures in their neighborhoods. Some etched their names on their bread molds like a signature. A preserved loaf from Pompeii bears the name Seller, likely the baker or the bakery. Inscriptions on tombs of bakers celebrate not battles or wealth, but consistency. He baked true and warm loaves for 40 years. That was praise enough. There was even a professional gilder, Collegium Pastorum, which organized bakers into a structured network. They held feasts, shared secrets, trained apprentices, and represented bakers' interests in court. Some gained wealth and status. Others, even if enslaved, could earn freedom by service to the guild. And what of the workers behind the ovens? They too became part of the city's rhythm. In graffiti and satirical plays, bakers were joked about as dough-fisted or yeast-headed, but also respected as essential. Without the baker, nothing else moved. A merchant could not travel, a soldier could not march, a senator could not speak all on an empty stomach. Some bakers passed their tools to their children. A son might inherit his father's dough trough, his paddle, his starter culture, fermentum, and with it, the relationships and obligations attached to them. But no legacy was more meaningful than trust. A baker's reliability was his name. If he promised bread by sunrise, it had to be their Ivan. If a storm had soaked the firewood, even if the grain was moldy, even if the night was freezing. And so they adapted, innovated, and endured. By mid-morning, most bakers were finished. They washed their hands in shallow basins, rubbed flour from their arms with olive oil, and sometimes dozed on benches near the door. A few drank wine or water mixed with vinegar. Others simply sat and watched the street go by, knowing that by the time the city sat for supper, they'd be asleep and would rise again long before the next loaf was wanted. But the story of Roman bread isn't just about supply and demand. In the next section, we'll explore how bread shaped Roman identity itself, fits place in rituals, its symbolism in status, and why a simple loaf could determine one's place in the social order. Bread, belonging, and the Roman identity. By the time the sun hovered at its highest point over the tiled rooftops of Rome, the loaves had already cooled. They sat in neat rows on wooden boards, their edges browned and cracked just slightly, their rounded tops dusted with ash or flour. Some were circular and pre-scored into wedges, others rectangular, shaped by hand into long blocks for slicing. These were not the puffy, golden loaves familiar to modern bakeries, but dense, coarse, and dark, their structure solid with purpose. They were made to nourish, not to delight. But in Rome, bread wasn't merely sustenance. It was status. It was a symbol of inclusion. It was a quiet signal of who you were, where you belonged, and whether the empire recognized your place in it. Let us begin with the Ponies Quadratus, perhaps the most iconic Roman loaf. Its shape, often depicted in reliefs and even preserved in carbonized form from Pompeii, was scored into 8 equal parts, much like a pie. This wasn't just for convenience. The scoring made it easier to divide, fairly useful for rationing and essential for those who lived communally, like soldiers or laborers. But the panis quadratus was also the bread of the masses. It was the standard loaf, baked by professional pistors and distributed widely through markets, stalls, and sometimes directly to the doorsteps of citizens. A small family might receive it as part of the unknown Rome's state grain dole. Others might buy it fresh in the forum, still warm in straw baskets. Those who were wealthier, however, had options. For them, there was ponies, Silagenia safina, whiter bread made from siligo or durum wheat. Its flour was sifted more thoroughly, its texture lighter, its color almost golden. It was labor-intensive to make and consumed primarily by the upper classes. To own and eat ponies, Silaginus, was to demonstrate one's refinement and economic power. It wasn't just a meal, it was a message. Then there was ponies militaris, the soldier's ration, dense, round, sometimes baked hard to last longer on campaigns. It could be softened in wine or water, or crumbled into soups. The military issued bread not only as nourishment, but as a token of identity. To be issued bread by the Roman army was to be recognized as part of its vast, sprawling machinery. Bread also permeated ritual and religion. During Saturnalia, loaves were baked in special molds, adorned with seeds or herbs, sometimes even formed in shapes. Offerings to the gods often included bread placed on altars or burned in hearths as part of sacrifices. Newlyweds, in some customs, would share a ceremonial loaf as a sign of shared provision. And when a child was born, neighbors might gift bread as a symbol of fortune and fertility. Even funerals were touched by the baker's hand. Inscriptions on tombs often mentioned bread, not just that a person was a baker, but that they provided bread to the people. Some freedmen, former slaves who became bakers, used their success in baking to elevate their families and claim a kind of quiet immortality. Tomb reliefs show baskets of loaves, rotary mills, and proud inscriptions. Panem dedit populo, he gave bread to the people. Bread could also be used for exclusion. During political upheavals, grain supplies could be weaponized. Opposing factions in Rome might withhold flour or restrict access to state bakeries. A loaf then became not just a meal, but a measure of loyalty. Were you with the Senate or the emperor? Did you support the reforms or resist them? In cities like Ostia or Alexandria, where grain was loaded onto ships bound for Rome, Sabotage or delay could ripple across the capital, affecting millions of loaves. There were even riots over bread. The fermentation's grain distributions could turn violent if supply fell short. Poor citizens depended on the grain dole not just for survival, but for dignity. To stand in line and return home with nothing meant not just hunger, but exclusion. And so the baker's role became more than functional. He was a hinge between chaos and calm. In Roman satire and plays, bread was shorthand for social commentary. Writers like Juvenal coined phrases still echoed today: Poneat circenses, bread and circuses, a critique of how easily the public could be placated with food and spectacle. Bread, in this sense, was not only material but political. Yet, amid this swirl of economy, identity, and power, the daily work of baking remained largely unchanged. The starter culture fermentum was preserved each day, kept alive through careful feeding and warmth. Some bakeries passed it on for generations, its microbial identity a quiet heirloom. When a new apprentice joined, part of his training was to understand the starter's mood, how it bubbled, how it smelled, how it reacted to the grain of that particular year. And the ovens, often blackened and cracked still, required the same discipline. Too much wood, and the crust burned. Too little, and the center collapsed. The baker adjusted instinctively, nudging loaves to the edges, listening for the hollow thump of readiness. Every batch was a conversation with fire. Some bakers also doubled as landlords or shopkeepers. Their bakeries had living quarters above or beside the workshop. A customer might knock on the window and call out for a specific loaf, and the baker's wife or child would retrieve it. The business was a family affair, and even in wealthier homes, private bakers enslaved or hired woke before the masters to ensure the bread was ready for the entaculum, the Roman breakfast. And what of those who fell through the cracks? There were always hungry mouths at the city's edge, children who picked crumbs from market stalls, workers who bartered labor for stale loaves. Some bakeries gave away yesterday's bread rather than waste it, and others left small offerings at crossroads for spirits or beggars. Charity, though not formalized, existed quietly in the baker's trade. As the day wound down and shadows lengthened across Rome's streets, a baker might count his coins, sweep the floor, and feed the fire one last time. He knew that long before. The next dawn, he would rise again, shaping the dough that shaped the city. And so, the Roman baker disappears into history not as a hero or conqueror, but as a steady, unseen hand. A quiet craftsman whose labor sustained emperors, soldiers, slaves, and poets alike. His world was ruled not by marble columns or legions, but by the simple alchemy of flour, water, and fire. We often speak of Rome's greatness in terms of roads, aqueducts, or conquests. But perhaps it is in the daily labor of the baker that we find something more enduring, something warmer, quieter, and just as essential now, as the last coals flicker in the ancient ovens and the city of Rome turns to sleep. We to let this story rest. The curious case of the disappearing barley. Welcome back, dear listener. Let us now travel, not to a grand hall of kings or a battlefield echoing with clashing steel, but to a small, mud-walled barn on the edge of a medieval village where something quite ordinary had gone terribly, quietly wrong. It is the early 1300s in England, in a countryside village with no name preserved in chronicles. The year is somewhere between harvest and the thaw of spring. In the early hours before sunrise, while most are still asleep under woolen blankets, a miller named Walter stands beside his barn. peering down at his barley sacks with furrowed brows. Barley is life here. It is the base of ale which is drunk, daily by old children, priests, even the reeve. It is also mixed into pottage or ground into coarse flour for flatbreads. Walter's livelihood depends on these sacks of grain, stored with care after the autumn harvest. But lately, the numbers haven't added up each week. He notices very subtly that the grain seems lighter than it should be. Not drastically so, just light enough to be suspicious. He had no scales to check precisely, of course, but he knew his stores like he knew his own boots. And now, that familiarity told him something was wrong. He suspected theft, but how and by whom? The barn was locked each night with an iron hasp and thick oak bar. The door creaked so loudly on its rusted hinges that no one could enter silently. No footprints had been found in the morning dew, and yet the barley diminished. Walter complained to the reeve, the local administrator responsible for justice. The reeve, a man named Edwin, listened patiently, his tunic smelling faintly of sheep's wool and mead. But he had heard many such tales before. Lost grain, a bad count, hungry rats, perhaps a servant stealing handfuls to feed a hungry child. But, Walter insisted, someone was taking his grain, slowly, carefully, and without detection. And so Edwin called in an unlikely expert, a local bone reader named Hilda. Now, dear listener, this is where the story bends quietly toward the strange. Hilda was not a wise woman in the mystical sense. She was no herbalist or spellcaster. She was, however, deeply familiar with one specific trade. She prepared bones, not for sorcery, but for a peculiar kind of rural forensic practice rooted in long-standing peasant knowledge. Farmers, butchers, and villagers had long observed that bones could tell stories of what a man ate, how he worked, whether an animal died in sickness or health. Hilda specialized in ox bones, and Walter had an ox. Oxen were the tractors of medieval Europe's low. Powerful, patient beasts used to pull plows, drag carts, and turn mills. They were not as fast as horses, but they were sturdier, less costly to maintain, and perhaps most importantly, predictable in their pace and behavior. Walter's ox, named Roderick, was used to walk a circular path, yoked to a long wooden pole that turned the grinding mill. His steps, every day, followed the same weary rhythm, round and round, slowly crushing grain beneath the millstone. And Hilda had an idea. You see, in those days, certain millzest relied on animal-driven grinding. When properly observed, the rhythm of the ox's movement was almost mechanical. If someone used the mill at night, in secret, the animal's bones would feel it. So Hilda made a proposal. She would examine Roderick's leg bones, particularly the metapodials, the long bones in the limbs, to determine whether they showed signs of unexpected strain. But how, you might wonder, could someone do this without killing the ox? The answer lay in palpation, feeling along the tendons and joints, identifying new inflammation or microscopic stress fractures common to bone and bone wear. It was subtle, primitive work, but not without precedent. In monasteries, bone healers sometimes treated worn joints in older draft animals. And Hilda had learned from one such friar in her youth. She asked Walter when the ox usually rested. Between dusk and dawn, he said, and yet Hilda discovered something strange. The ox's rear knees were slightly inflamed, and one hoof was showing signs of increased wearinly on the outer edge. This meant Roderick had been walking. At night, someone had unyoked the ox, attached the mill arm, and used him to grind grain after Walter had gone to sleep. This in itself wasn't proof of theft, but it narrowed the possibilities. No one without access to the barn knowledge of the harness and comfort with the ox could do it. So the reeve laid a quiet trap. On the third night, he and 2 others hid behind the hay racks near the barn. They brought no torches, for they knew the thief would spot light from far off. They waited in silence, breath clouding in the cool air, surrounded by the scent of dry barley and old straw. And just before midnight, they heard ither faint creak of wood, the clink of a harness, the low, reluctant grunt of Roderick. A boy appeared, thin, perhaps 17. His name was Alric. He was Walter's former apprentice. He had been dismissed 2 winters ago for laziness and clumsiness. But he hadn't left the village. He had remained nearby, doing odd jobs, sleeping in stables and unused sheds. No one thought him dangerous, just a bit foolish. But now, it seemed, he had found a way to live off Walter's stores, grinding his own grain at night and selling the flour quietly to travelers or innkeepers. Ulrich was caught and questioned. He confessed almost immediately, more from fear than cunning. But here is where the story turns, again, because Ulrich claimed he had never broken the lock. Instead, he had used a second key, one he had carved, long ago, from a sliver of deer antler. He'd pressed the original in beeswax, then whittled a copy in secret, a crude copy. But it worked. The barley theft had been real. The ox had been the unwitting accomplice, and it was the bones, aching and worn, that told the tale. In the end, Ulrich was not hanged. He was sentenced instead to serve 2 years' labor in the reeves fields and to make restitution in flour. Perhaps it was pity. Perhaps it was that no one wanted to lose a pair of young hands over a few sacks of barley. But word of Hilda's methods spread, and soon other villages, especially in the rural shires of eastern England, began to experiment with observing oxen, carts, and draft animals for hidden signs of labor. The phrase "the ox remembers" even became a quiet proverb in some areas, passed between farmers as both wisdom and warning. So, as the barn doors creak shut and the ox settles in straw once more, we are left with a thought. How many other stories, how many small crimes or quiet truths were carried not in words, but in bones? The Bone Reader's Book of Clues the following spring, as snow melted from thatched roofs, and the thatches themselves sagged a little lower under damp weight. Hilda, the bone reader, found herself busier than she'd ever imagined. Not that she would have called herself busy. She still rose before sunrise to stoke the fire, still walked the same muddy paths in the same heavy boots. But ever since word spread of her discovery in Walter's barn, the thief uncovered not by shouting or searching, but by quietly listening to the ox's limbs, Hilda had become a minor authority, and so, across the fields and fens, she travelled, with her basket, her shawl, and her strange little notebook. Not many villagers in 14th century England had books, let alone a book of one's own. Hilda's notebook was little more than a folded sheaf of parchment stitched into leather, with short notes in ink made from crushed oak galls and soot. It smelled faintly of vinegar and mutton fat, and its pages bore cryptic entries like goat bones, split distal edge equals drop or drag on stone path, cart mule joint swell equals heavy grain theft, check wheel ruts. This was her book of clues. And though she did not know it, in a way, she was an early observer of biomechanical forensic clues centuries before the word forensics had any common meaning. Let us visit one of her next investigations. It was in the village of Elmsmere, where a local reeve was puzzled by broken wheels specifically, a cart that collapsed after hauling too much firewood. The cart had always been sound, and the wheelwright swore it had been inspected just a month earlier, when Hilda was called in. She examined not the cart, but the donkeys. You see, walk with a deliberate gait, and when overloaded, they develop a characteristic limp knot, obvious to the untrained eye, but noticeable in the wear pattern on the rear knees and the angle of the fetlock joint. Sure enough, Hilda found these signs on the right hind leg. Her guess: someone had loaded the donkey far beyond safe weight, repeatedly, probably at night. To avoid detection, her suspicion was confirmed when she checked the path outside the woodshed. Deep impressions in the thawing earth, along with spilled chips of spruce and yew. The culprit was the blacksmith's cousin, who had been quietly cutting timber from the Lord's woods and carting it to the next village for coin. The donkey, tired and sore, had told the tale without a word. Hilda wrote in her notebook that day, "Animal strain can outlast witness silence." This was not magic, she would say. It was patience and careful eyes. Now, it's important to remember, bone reading was not common, nor widely understood. Most villagers still trusted more immediate signs: a missing loaf, a suspicious boot print. And indeed, some thought Hilda's talents bordered on meddling, or worse, witchcraft. But Hilda kept her work simple. She always explained what she saw. Here, worn hooves thereand. She never made claims without reason. Her calm manner, and her odd but firm grasp of animal habits, won her a slow and steady trust. She was soon invited to market towns on feast days, where livestock was brought for sale. Farmers would hand her a chicken, a sheep, or a dog, and ask, "What do the bones say?" She often shook her head gently and replied, "The bones aren't speaking today." But now and then they did. One such case came from a cooper named Hugh, whose apple barrels had been mysteriously tampered with. They weren't stolen, but always rearranged. Staves missing. Iron hoops swapped. Hilda examined the workshop's cart horse. Once again, she found light bruising around the shoulders and flanks, where a poorly balanced barrel had rubbed and shifted. She also noticed tiny red marks on the legs, rust from damp iron hoops. Hugh's apprentice had been lifting pieces out in secret to build his own makeshift cider press near the orchard. The barrels hadn't walked themselves, but the horse had felt their absence and imbalance. By summer, Hilda's quiet investigations had grown into a pattern: always small crimes, always small clues. She became particularly adept at what she called sleep thief, tracing where a thief used animals during the night. In villages with no clocks and no oil lamps, night work was rare. So when a goose waddled stiffly or a sow limped unexpectedly, she'd look closer. She discovered a servant using a pig to smuggle stolen turnips, a goose that had been tethered too tightly to warn of intruders, its ankles bruised from panic flapping, a cow whose udders were being milked before sunrise by a neighbor with a broken fence. Each case left a small mark, not on the surface but in the joints, the posture, the weight of each step. And always, Hilda listened, not to words, but to rhythm. The slow, dependable rhythm of animals who knew what normal felt like, and who, when disrupted, could not help but show it. She would often say, in her quiet way, "People forget, but the body doesn't, especially not theirs." And while her methods never made it to royal courts or cathedral towns, they spread slowly among shepherds, reeves, and aging farmers. A second oxbone reader even appeared one winter in Sussex. A woman named Mera, who had learnt from Hilda's notes. Mera carried a satchel of smooth stones and compared hoofprints for strain angles. Together, they shared their findings in short scribbled letters, sealed with wax and bound in sheep gut. Today, none of these parchments survive, but in one dusty cellar in Lincolnshire, a single ox metopodial remains, wrapped in faded linen, scrawled on the cloth in a hand now unknown, not just a bone, a memory. The last case of the oxbone reader by the time the winter of 1341 arrived. Hilda was known by name across no fewer than 8 parishes. Farmers, shepherds, and even a few abbots sent word by boys with muddy boots. Come see our mule, or the ox limps after market, but not before, or there's trouble with our lambs, though none are missing. She never refused a request, but she no longer travelled as lightly as she had. Her bones, too, were beginning to speak in a quiet, aching language of knees and hips, familiar to anyone who was bent over one too many cold fields or sat for hours on the edge of a stone fence waiting for a goat to move naturally. Hilda moved more slowly, and her eyes sometimes blurred when she examined the fine lines around, a joint or a subtle twist in a leg, but her mind remained precise. So when she received a message, an unusually neat one, written in Latin and sent by a scribe from the manor of Lord Edric of Crendon, she was both flattered and cautious. The letter bore a small green wax seal and read, "A theft has occurred, not of goods, but of presents. We request the quiet aid of your observations." The phrase intrigued her. Not of goods, but of presents, and so she went. The manor at Crendon was larger than any place Hilda had visited before. Wide stone walls, a granary, 3 enclosed pastures, and a dovecote taller than any steeple in her village. But it was oddly silent for its size. A few chickens scratched in the frozen dirt, but no workers called, no dogs barked. Lord Edric, a man in his early 60s with trembling hands, met her in the inner yard and explained, "We believe a message is being sent," he said. "Not words, not signs, just a pattern." He led her to the stable. There, 12 fine horses stood in their stalls, shivering slightly, and outside, 3 oxen stood yoked but unsupervised, already fitted to a cart not scheduled to move until spring. "Nothing's gone," he said. "No doors broken, no grain missing, no tools out of place. But each morning the horses seem agitated, and the oxen shift weight as though they've pulled something." Hilda observed them carefully. She asked for warm water to wash their legs, revealing any bruises or pressure marks more clearly. Sure enough, faint red lines crossed each ox's front pasterns, too shallow for shackles, too sharp for simple restlessness. Their hooves also showed light mud, though the pastures were snowbound. Something had moved them, but why? She turned to the horses. They had no external wounds, but one had slightly chipped a lower incisor, nervous behavior, common in animals that grind their teeth out of stress. Another horse had rubbed the side of its head raw against the stall post. A third had manure flecked with undigested haste of a sudden change in feed or gut tension. "Someone's been in here," she told Lord Edric, "but not to steal, to frighten." She asked for a fresh candle, and at dusk, she returned to the stable and waited hours passed. Snow thickened on the beams above. A mouse scurried once along the feed box, but the door did not creak. No shadow fell across the threshold. Still, the horses shifted uneasily, and the oxen stamped one foot in unison, as if on cue. That night, Hilda slept in the granary, where she felt safest between walls of quiet grain and the scent of barley husk. She dreamed of hoofbeats that didn't echo the next day. She began testing the earth. Crendon's yard was paved with compacted soil and stone chips, hard as fired clay. But behind the dovecote, just outside the ox yard, was a patch of softer loam. There, under a covering of wind-blown snow, she found a footprint human, small and deliberate. It faced inward. Someone had stood there, still, for quite some time. She followed the trail, carefully brushing away the light crust of snow with a pine bow. The footprints led to a cluster of trees and then vanished erased, perhaps intentionally, but near the largest tree, where the bark was scarred with old knife marks, she found a curious thing, an ox bone, hollowed slightly and strung with a loop of hemp cord, a kind of charm or perhaps a signal. She brought it back to Lord Edric. "I believe," she said, "that this is not the work of a thief. It's a memory." He looked at her, puzzled. "There's someone here," she continued, "who wants to remind the oxen what it felt like to haul something heavy. Not for profit, not to harm, just to make them remember. The stress, the pull, the fear, Lord." Edric frowned. "Why?" Hilda shrugged gently. "Someone with a grievance. Perhaps they were once punished unfairly here. Perhaps they wish the animals to bear a portion of that memory." Over the next week, she watched. She placed her own, carved bone marked with soot in the same spot beneath the tree, then waited each night from the granary loft. On the 5th night, a figure came, thin, hunched, cloaked in dark wool. They picked up the bone gently, turned it in their hands, and slipped away again. Hilda never chased them. She didn't need to. Instead, she left a note ink on bark at the base of the tree. The bones remember, but they forgive. The visits stopped. Lord Edric paid her in linen and salt, and the oxen calmed. The horses no longer pawed or chewed. It was not a story with a name, nor one that ended in punishment. But it was, perhaps, a resolution. The manor returned to its quiet rhythm, and Hilda to hers. Years later, when her knees had stiffened fully and her hands trembled more than Lord Edric's ever had, she gave her book of clues to a young stable girl named Freda. Freda was quiet, curious, and already watched animals with the kind of gaze that asked no questions aloud. "Let the bones tell you," Hilda whispered one morning as she handed over the pages, but never forced them to speak. "They do best when you're not trying too hard to listen." And then she faded from the villagers' stories, slowly, quietly, like a hoofprint filling with spring water. Her legacy lived on in a few copied notes, in the quiet warnings passed, from one shepherd to another, and perhaps in the stillness of oxen who knew someone once listened and heard them. The Mughal Empire is often remembered for its grandeur, its forts of red sandstone, its minarets rising like prayers into the sky, its courtly poetry, and the endless shimmer of jewels and silk. But the truth is, much of that splendor was held up not by war, elephants, or gold, but by quiet hands tending soil. A gardener did not command armies. He did not debate policy. He wore no rings, and his name rarely appeared in royal accounts. But still, the emperor's peace depended on him, each day. In the shadow of imperial domes, he walked barefoot across warm flagstones, carrying clay jugs and palm fans. He worked in moonlight so his emperor could wake to do. He trained oxen to move. In silence, he stirred earth so gently that trees thought it was the wind, and all this, not for praise or position, but for the quiet. Because in that stillness, In that near-perfect hush of pre-dawn water, something greater than power took root. The illusion of effortless beauty. The sense that an entire world could remain in balance, held together by slow-moving water, shaded pathways, and the grace of men who knew how not to wake a king. And that, perhaps, is the most boring but most beautiful truth of history, that sometimes the greatest empires were held up by those who never spoke too loud, who never walked too fast, and who always knew which roots needed water long before anyone asked.